in the quiet depths of space, where the stars twinkle like distant, indifferent witnesses, something waits, something darker than the abyss itself, silent, relentless, and unforgiving. It is here, in the cold expanse of the unknown, where human ambition faces its most terrifying trial, a place where even the bravest men and women are tested, pushed to the edge of their very souls. But for some, the edge is all too real. Space, a realm of infinite possibility, has claimed its fair share of explorers. What many don't know, though, is that for every triumph, there lies a hidden danger, a shadow that lurks just beyond the stars. A single mistake, an unseen flaw, a moment of carelessness, these things are enough to turn the greatest adventure into a nightmarish struggle for survival. You've heard the stories of the great successes, the flags planted on alien soils, the shining triumphs that echo in the history books. But there are others, darker tales, stories of missions that should have never been. Missions that didn't end in victory, but in something far worse, where heroes became ghosts, and the cold silence of space whispered of the horrors they faced. In the deep, infinite black, the countdown begins, a journey that will take you beyond the safety of Earth, into the terrifying unknown. Brace yourself for a series of stories that will chill you to your core. These are the stories of space exploration's darkest moments, the moments where everything went wrong, where men and women of courage and intellect ventured into a world they thought they could master, only to face the cold, horrific truth that no one can ever truly control the void. So, take a deep breath, if you dare. The journey begins now. The fire that took Apollo 1, a spark can be the loudest scream in space. It started like any other day in the unyielding march toward the stars. The year was 1967, and the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was nearing its boiling point. For NASA, Apollo 1 was a critical step, a mission designed to test the limits of human ingenuity and prepare for the first manned moon landing. Optimism filled the air, but so did something darker, an unspoken tension that lingered in the shadows. The crew of Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, a veteran of spaceflight, Ed White, the first American to walk in space, and Roger B. Chaffee, a rookie eager to prove himself, climbed into the capsule that day with quiet determination. The spacecraft loomed before them, a monument of human ambition, sleek and cold, gleaming under the artificial lights of the Kennedy Space Center. No one dared say it aloud, but there was an undercurrent of unease. The spacecraft had been plagued with technical issues, loose wiring, strange smells, and communication glitches that seemed to whisper warnings no one wanted to hear. Inside the capsule, the air was oppressively hot. The three men were strapped into their seats, their suits bulky and stiff, their breathing audible through the microphones. The hatch, a complex mechanism designed to seal them from the vacuum of space, was shut tightly behind them. It was a rehearsal, not a launch, a simple simulation to test the spacecraft's systems while it remained safely on the ground. But there was nothing safe about the atmosphere inside. The air was pure oxygen, a decision made to simplify life support systems. No one had anticipated how dangerous it could become. The technicians on the ground were busy, their voices buzzing over the intercom. Problems arose almost immediately. Communication between the crew and the ground was garbled, distorted, as if the capsule were resisting their attempts to make contact. Grissom's voice cut through the static, sharp and impatient. "How are we supposed to talk to you from the moon if we can't even talk to you from 3 buildings away?" Laughter rippled through the control room, but it was nervous laughter. Frustration simmered on both sides of the radio. The minutes stretched into hours, and the temperature inside the capsule climbed. Sweat dripped down the men's faces, soaking into the fabric of their suits. They were growing restless, their movements small but tense, like animals trapped in a cage. Outside, the technicians adjusted switches, oblivious to the storm brewing just out of sight. Then it happened. A spark. No one knows exactly where it started. Some say it was a frayed wire, others suspect an electrical fault in the control panel. What everyone agrees on is that the spark found its mark in the oxygen-rich atmosphere of the capsule. It began as a flicker, a tiny flame that danced along the wires like a living thing, hungry and wild. Inside the spacecraft, the men didn't see it at first. They smelled it. A sharp, acrid scent filled the air, cutting through the metallic tang of the oxygen. Grissom was the first to react. "Do you smell that? Something's burning." The crew's voices overlapped in confusion. The flame, invisible at first, began to grow. It spread with terrifying speed, consuming the wires, the insulation, the very air they breathed. It moved like a living entity, a predator unleashed in the confined space. White-hot and relentless, it wrapped itself around the men, their suits, their bodies. "Fire in the cockpit!" Chaffee's voice, sharp with panic, rang out over the intercom. "We've got a fire in here!" On the ground, technicians scrambled, their faces pale with disbelief. The fire alarm screamed, but there was no time. The hatch, designed to withstand the pressures of space, was a fortress. It took 90 seconds to open under normal conditions, but the fire didn't give them even half that. Inside, the crew fought desperately. White struggled to release his harness, his gloved hands fumbling with the restraints. Grissom reached for the controls, his fingers blistering as the flames consumed the console. Chaffee's screams echoed, raw and guttural, until they were swallowed by the roar of the fire. The heat was unbearable, the air toxic. The men were suffocating, burning alive in a tomb of their own making. The technicians outside clawed at the hatch, their tools slipping in their sweat-slick hands. The heat radiated through the metal, scalding their palms. The smell of burning flesh seeped through the seams, a sickening reminder of the lives trapped inside. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the fire stopped. The oxygen burned away in seconds, leaving nothing but silence. The technicians finally breached the hatch, their faces twisted with horror. Inside, the capsule was unrecognizable. The walls were charred, the instruments melted into unidentifiable shapes. The three men, their bodies blackened and twisted, sat motionless in their seats, their helmets melted to their faces. The control room was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of what had happened settled over them like a shroud. These were heroes, men who had dared to reach for the stars, reduced to ashes in a matter of moments. The tragedy was made all the more unbearable by its senselessness, its preventability. The Apollo program ground to a halt, consumed by grief and guilt. But the haunting didn't end there. The capsule was dismantled, its pieces examined and re-examined, as if they might yield some secret, some answer to the question no one could ask aloud. Why? The remains of Grissom, White, and Chaffee were laid to rest, but their voices lingered. Technicians reported hearing whispers in the hangars at night, faint and indistinct, as if the men were still trying to communicate from beyond the veil. The Apollo program eventually resumed, but the shadow of Apollo 1 never lifted. Every launch, every success, carried with it the memory of that day, the unspoken fear that another spark might ignite, another crew might be lost. The astronauts who followed in Grissom, White, and Chaffee's footsteps carried their legacy with them, a reminder of the price of human ambition. And still, the silence lingers, a silence that speaks of fire and death, and the cries of men who reached for the stars but found only darkness. The Challenger, disaster. The sky isn't always the limit. It's sometimes the grave. January 28, 1986. A cold, cruel morning in Cape Canaveral, Florida. The air was biting, uncharacteristically frigid for the region, and icicles hung like daggers from the launch tower. The sight was unusual, foreboding even, but no one dared say it aloud. The Challenger shuttle loomed on the launch pad, a symbol of hope, progress, and human ingenuity. But beneath its gleaming exterior, invisible threats lurked in silence, waiting for their moment to strike. The crew was 7 strong, a mix of seasoned astronauts and dreamers stepping into the heavens for the first time. Among them was Krista McAuliffe, a school teacher turned astronaut, chosen to inspire a generation. Her inclusion on the mission made this flight special. Millions of children across the country waited eagerly by their TVs, their young eyes fixed on the skies. They saw only the promise of adventure, of endless possibilities. No one saw the shadows. The engineers had seen them, though, in the days and hours leading up to the launch. The O-rings, critical seals in the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, had been acting strangely, stiffening in cold weather during previous tests. The sub-freezing temperatures that morning posed an untested risk. Concerns were raised, whispered in closed rooms and over hurried phone calls, but the countdown continued. The pressure to launch was immense. Delays cost millions, and the public's patience was wearing thin. "Godspeed, Challenger," came the final message from the ground. The engines roared to life, and the shuttle clawed its way into the sky, a blazing comet against the pale morning light. For 73 seconds, everything seemed perfect. The shuttle ascended with grace, its contrails painting the air in bold white strokes. Inside the cabin, the crew floated in their seats, their laughter and chatter muted by the hum of the engines. They were alive, soaring higher than the limits of Earth's gravity, their faces lit with awe. Then it happened. 74 seconds into the flight, the shuttle was 46,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean when the unseen cracks in the O-rings gave way. The seals failed, allowing a jet of flame to pierce the side of the solid rocket booster. Like a serpent, the flame slithered toward the external fuel tank, an immense reservoir filled with liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. It didn't take long. At T plus 73.6 seconds, the fuel tank erupted. The explosion was sudden, violent, and terrifyingly beautiful. On the ground, spectators gasped as the bright fireball bloomed in the sky, its tendrils curling outward like a monstrous flower. For a moment, they didn't understand. To many, it looked like an unusual maneuver, a strange twist in the shuttle's trajectory. But then the awful truth began to dawn. The Challenger had been torn apart. Inside the cabin, the crew was alive, at least for a few more moments. The explosion didn't kill them instantly. Instead, the cockpit was ripped free from the rest of the shuttle, a fragile bubble of life tumbling through the chaos. The astronauts were thrown against their harnesses, disoriented and helpless. Alarms blared, but there was nothing they could do. The controls were dead, the systems unresponsive. The cabin plummeted toward the ocean, a cruel, inexorable descent. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they fell. It's believed that some of the crew remained conscious during this time. Krista McAuliffe's personal recorder, later recovered from the wreckage, revealed fragments of sound, sharp breaths, muted cries, the desperate click of switches as they tried to regain control. One of them, likely the pilot, had activated the reserve oxygen supply, a futile gesture that only prolonged their awareness of the inevitable. On the ground, chaos reigned. The crowd, which had moments before been cheering, now stood frozen, their faces pale and their mouths agape. Children cried, their parents unable to console them as the smoke trails in the sky twisted into a grim tapestry. News anchors stumbled over their words, their voices shaking as they tried to make sense of the horror unfolding before their eyes. The cabin struck the ocean at nearly 200 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic, the final blow in a series of cruel fates. The remains of the Challenger sank into the cold depths, carrying with it the shattered dreams of its crew and the hopes of millions watching from afar. But the horror didn't end with the explosion. In the days that followed, investigators scoured the wreckage, pulling pieces of the shuttle from the ocean floor. What they found was chilling. The O-rings, those fragile rubber seals, had failed exactly as the engineers had feared. The freezing temperatures had rendered them brittle, incapable of maintaining the integrity of the rocket boosters. The warnings had been there all along, unheeded in the race to meet deadlines. The families of the crew were left to grieve, their sorrow amplified by the public scrutiny. Krista McAuliffe's students, who had watched the launch with pride, now stared at their empty classroom, their young hearts burdened with a loss they couldn't fully comprehend. Even now, the Challenger disaster lingers in the collective memory, a ghostly reminder of the risks inherent in human ambition. The launch pad, once a place of hope, became a site of mourning. Whispers of the tragedy spread through NASA's halls. Technicians reported hearing faint voices near the reconstruction site, soft and indistinct, as if the crew were still calling out from the void. And in the silence of the night, when the wind carries the faint echoes of the past, one can almost hear the final moments of Challenger's crew, 7 souls trapped in freefall, their dreams of reaching the stars consumed by fire and gravity. They remain suspended in history, their legacy a testament to both the courage and the fragility of those who dare to leave Earth behind. The dark shadow of Soyuz 11. In the depths of space, far from the comforting warmth of Earth, there lies an abyss so vast it swallows all hope and dreams. This is the story of the Soyuz 11 disaster, a haunting tale of bravery, human ambition, and the chilling, unforgiving void of space. It begins in 1971, a time when the race for space supremacy had become a silent war between the two Cold War titans, the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet space program, determined to prove its dominance, had made a historic achievement by launching the world's first space station, Salyut 1. But a dream, however grand, can quickly turn into a nightmare when the unforgiving nature of space decides to test humanity's resolve. Soyuz 10 had failed to dock with Salyut 1 earlier that year. The crew was forced to return in a harrowing descent. But this wasn't the end of the mission, not by a long shot. The Soviet Union wasn't ready to give up, and so, in the haunting cold of the night sky, Soyuz 11 was prepared for a mission that would eventually become etched in the annals of space history for all the wrong reasons. 3 men, cosmonauts, were chosen for the Soyuz 11 mission: Georgy Dobrovolsky, Viktor Patsayev, and Vladislav Volkov. Their faces, painted with determination, hid the unspoken fear that weighed heavily on their hearts. They were to travel to the Salyut 1 space station, dock, and spend 23 days performing experiments and conducting research. There was nothing special about the mission in the eyes of many, but for these men, it would be the last journey they would ever take. The launch occurred on June 6, 1971. A cold, pre-dawn morning cloaked in mystery. The rocket, towering over the launch pad, crackled with energy as it prepared to send the men on their voyage into the heavens. As the countdown began, a peculiar sense of dread settled over the ground crew. Their training, their routines, had all led to this moment, but something didn't feel right. The rocket soared into the dark, a silver streak cutting through the early light. The cosmonauts inside Soyuz 11 were poised, eager, unaware that the true horror of space awaited them, far beyond the reach of the Earth's comforting embrace. As Soyuz 11 journeyed into orbit, the trio aboard the spacecraft followed their training. They were professionals, seasoned men of the Soviet space program. Their mission was straightforward: dock with Salyut 1, enter the station, complete the research, and then return home to Earth, hailed as heroes. But as the hours passed, the feeling of unease only grew. A silence settled in the capsule that was suffocating, a silence that stretched for what seemed like eternity. Docking with Salyut 1 was a delicate procedure, but the men had done this before, many times. They aligned Soyuz 11 carefully with the station, and the hatch opened. For the first time in history, humans entered the Salyut space station. The air was thin, the walls adorned with scientific equipment and instruments, the walls of metal encasing them in a tomb-like atmosphere. At first, everything appeared to be going smoothly. But when the cosmonauts began their experiments, they noticed something strange. The air was heavier, more suffocating. There was a faint odor, like stale metal, that hung in the air. A noise, a faint, almost imperceptible hiss, echoed through the station. It was too quiet. The men were beginning to feel it now, the creeping sense that something was terribly wrong. Hours passed, and then the unthinkable happened. A fatal flaw in the station's ventilation system had been overlooked. An unnoticed leak in the oxygen supply slowly, silently, and tragically drained the precious air that the men needed to survive. It was a slow, insidious killer, and it worked unnoticed, a silent assassin that would rob them of their very breath. The crew inside Soyuz 11 did not feel it at first, but by the time they began to notice the symptoms, lightheadedness, confusion, an inability to focus, it was already too late. The trio, now gasping for air in the suffocating void, struggled desperately to reach the capsule and return to Earth. But the damage had been done. The station's atmosphere had already become toxic, and their bodies began to fail them. The countdown to return to Earth was almost upon them. The time had come to re-enter Soyuz 11 and leave Salyut 1 behind. But as the cosmonauts struggled back to the spacecraft, they were already beyond saving. The vacuum of space was closing in, and no matter how they fought, there was nothing they could do. Soyuz 11 detached from Salyut 1 and began its descent back to Earth. However, the horrifying reality struck with brutal force. As the spacecraft re-entered the atmosphere, the men inside were already unconscious. When the capsule reached the surface, it did so with the haunting finality of a tomb closing for good. The recovery team reached Soyuz 11 hours after the capsule landed. What they found inside was more than just the lifeless bodies of 3 men. They found evidence of a struggle, of desperate attempts to escape a fate they could not avoid. The horror had already taken place. The oxygen had been depleted, and the men had suffocated in the vacuum of space, their bodies betraying the final moments of terror that had gripped them. The tragedy of Soyuz 11 was a wake-up call to the space community. It was a dark reminder of the dangers lurking in the infinite blackness of space, where even the slightest error could lead to the most unimaginable consequences. But what haunted the world most was the eerie silence of the aftermath. There were no flashing lights, no explosions in the sky. Just the cold, still bodies of 3 brave men who had given everything for humanity's journey into the unknown. Their names were etched into history, but the true story of what happened aboard Soyuz 11 would remain forever shrouded in the cold, unforgiving vacuum of space. And so the story of Soyuz 11 ended in a deathly silence. No hero's welcome, no victory parade. Only the chilling certainty that in space, the boundaries between life and death are fragile, and sometimes those who venture into the great unknown never return. The silence of the star. In the endless expanse of space, there is a place where light falters, and the weight of isolation is heavier than any earthly burden. It is here, on a forgotten mission that would change the course of history, that a catastrophe occurred, one of the most horrifying events in the history of space exploration. It's a story you might not have heard of, for it is shrouded in secrecy, and its horror lingers long after its tragic end. This is the tale of the Apollo 13 mission, a harrowing journey where hope and terror were separated by mere moments. The year was 1970. The world had already witnessed the triumphs and failures of space exploration. The Apollo program had reached the stars, sending men to the moon, proving that humanity could break free from the bonds of Earth. But Apollo 13 was different. It was not just another mission. It was an endeavor of survival. The crew of Apollo 13 was composed of 3 men: James Lovell, the seasoned commander; John Swigert, the astronaut who had recently been swapped in for another crew member; and Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot. They were prepared for what many considered a routine mission: a flight to the moon, to land, collect samples, and return home as heroes. It seemed like any other mission in the long list of Apollo flights, but it would prove to be a nightmare that no one saw coming. The journey began like so many others, an air of excitement, a sense of purpose. As the Saturn V rocket lifted off from Kennedy Space Center on April 11, 1970, the crew's voices crackled through the radio, filled with energy and optimism. They were heading into the vast unknown, but they were prepared, or so they thought. Everything was fine for the first few days of the mission. The spacecraft sailed smoothly through space, with Lovell, Swigert, and Hayes continuing their operations. They were in high spirits, marveling at the view of Earth growing smaller and smaller, until in the cold vacuum of space, something happened that would shatter their peaceful ascent into the cosmos. At 56 hours into the mission, an ominous sound echoed through the spacecraft, a loud, deafening bang, followed by an eerie silence. The crew sat frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief as a warning light flashed across the control panel. The spacecraft was shaking violently, and then came the words that would forever haunt the men on board. "Houston, we've had a problem." The words, spoken by Swigert, seemed almost surreal. There had been no warning, no signs of trouble. The astronauts were experts, trained to handle any number of contingencies. Yet nothing in their training had prepared them for this. The explosion had ruptured the service module's oxygen tank, leaving the spacecraft spiraling into a crisis that no one could have foreseen. The astronauts found themselves in the middle of a dark ocean of space, without the means to breathe, to survive, or to communicate with Earth. The severity of the explosion began to sink in. The spacecraft's oxygen system had been damaged, meaning the crew was running out of breathable air. Without it, they would suffocate. The temperature inside the spacecraft dropped. Soon, the instruments began to flicker, and communications with Earth became increasingly difficult. The once cozy command module, which had seemed so familiar, now felt like a tomb. Lovell, Swigert, and Hayes were stranded in the cold, empty abyss of space, but their calm under pressure was the only thing that kept them alive. They had trained for emergencies, but nothing could have prepared them for the magnitude of this crisis. Every second counted. Every decision would determine whether they lived or died. Back on Earth, the tension in mission control was palpable. The silence on the other side of the radio felt like an eternity. The team of engineers and technicians scrambled to figure out how to bring the men home. They were given no time to mourn or to grieve. There was only one objective now: survival. But with every calculation and every command sent to Apollo 13, the odds grew longer. Would they be able to make it back to Earth? Or were the astronauts doomed to drift forever in the infinite blackness of space? Meanwhile, inside the crippled spacecraft, the astronauts worked tirelessly, trying to figure out how to keep themselves alive. They powered down systems to conserve energy. They used the lunar module, which had been designed for a moon landing, as a lifeboat, a fragile, temporary shelter in the unrelenting cold of space. They rationed their remaining water and food, but with every passing hour, the air grew thicker with the fear that they might never see their families again. The horrifying realization of what was happening didn't come immediately, but soon it became clear that the explosion had crippled the spacecraft's ability to land on the moon, and the crew would have to abandon their mission. But that wasn't their greatest challenge. Their greatest challenge was to survive the journey back to Earth. In the cramped lunar module, Lovell, Swigert, and Hayes were left to pray that the spacecraft's makeshift systems would hold long enough to get them back home. There were moments when the spacecraft seemed to almost groan in agony, as if it too was desperate to survive. They were mere ants, clinging to a fragile vessel that was hurtling through the endless dark, uncertain if it would survive re-entry, or if they would burn alive in the inferno of the Earth's atmosphere. The tension was unbearable. The once sturdy spacecraft, now damaged and battered, felt like a coffin in the depths of space. The astronauts could hear the ticking of their life support systems as they desperately tried to navigate through space with a crippled spacecraft and limited resources. Every maneuver, every course correction was a gamble. There was no guarantee they would make it. Finally, after days of uncertainty, they entered the Earth's atmosphere. The spacecraft heated up as friction from re-entry tore at its fragile hull. It was a race against time. Would they burn up? Would they survive? As the heat of re-entry reached its peak, Lovell, Swigert, and Hayes held their breath, praying for the parachutes to deploy. They had done everything they could, but fate had one last test for them. Would their painstaking efforts, their courage under the darkest of circumstances, pay off? The parachutes finally deployed. The tension in mission control erupted into a silent cheer. Apollo 13 had made it. The crew of Apollo 13, battered and broken, were safely recovered from the ocean, exhausted but alive. They had defied the odds and returned home, but the story of their journey, their terrifying, soul-crushing experience in the cold, silent expanse of space, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The crew had survived the greatest test of their careers. But the true horror lay not in the disaster itself, but in the knowledge that in space, no amount of preparation can truly safeguard you from the unknown dangers that lurk out there. And sometimes, even in the face of disaster, it's not the victory that haunts you, but the terrible, suffocating silence that surrounds you when the void opens its jaws, waiting to swallow everything whole. Apollo 13's mission ended in success, but the true terror of that experience was one that no one would ever forget. The astronauts' names would be remembered, their story told. Yet, in the deepest corners of space, where darkness reigns and no one can hear you scream, the silence of the void remains, waiting to claim its next victim.